Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Success After Trauma, where we bring on special guests and they share unique stories and journeys that they've been through, challenges that they faced, what it was like when they were really in the heat of that moment, the aha, and how they were able to get through, and then what they're doing to serve today. Our guest, Erin, has a very unique story. She has had a she had her awakening and stepping into her power, becoming a coach, and serving others through the modalities that she serves through as a coach, and then was faced with what she's going to share with you guys, a life altering physical health condition that completely rocked her down to the core. It forced her to really connect with, align with, and utilize all the tools that she crafted, created, learned, and shares with others as a coach. And as she utilized these tools and as she helped herself navigate through this dark moment and this dark chapter, this heavier chapter, she had some realizations, some changes, some shifts, and wrote a book. Erin's book is called Finding Ahimsa. It's Ahimsa, and it's a word I had never heard before today. And if you're anything like me, you may not have heard the word either. Erin, would you share with us a little bit about what this word means, and even how did you find this word as a title for your book?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Greg. I had not come across this word ahimsa myself. It's a Sanskrit word. I didn't come across it until I was studying nonviolent communication. And a lot of people get turned off by that word nonviolent. And so I was curious, what does what is this word nonviolent? Where did it come from? And it turns out that the word nonviolent is a really clunky translation for this word ahimsa. And in Sanskrit, this word ahimsa means having a heart so open you have no enemies. So it's related to non-judgment, compassion, empathy. So yeah, the book was it started out actually as a bunch of journal entries. It was me trying to process what was happening in real time.
And Erin, would you forgive me, but would you I've got to hear a little bit of, but would you just kind of like time morph us back and take would you just do like a flashback now and take us up to what you went through that created this journaling that in turn created this book?
Yeah, sure. So in March 2020, this is just at the very beginning of the pandemic. I homeschool my kids, and we had been doing all kinds of learning around fairy tales. And there was this fairy tale, or no, actually, we decided that we were going to go and see Beauty and the Beast in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, which is where I'm from. And it was opening night. And, we had heard about the pandemic starting, but it didn't really seem to be happening. It wasn't really on anyone's consciousness at that time. So we went to Toronto. We live just outside of Toronto. We went to Toronto and we did like every super spreader activity possible. We got stuck on the subway with no air circulation for like 45 minutes. We went to the busiest mall in Toronto. My kids are like licking the handles of doorknobs, like awful.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. Super busy restaurants. And then we went to this play. And I remember I was sitting right beside someone who was coughing up a storm. And so, we went to this play. It was 3 hours sitting close together. And this is, just before people are starting to think about the pandemic, beginning of March 2020 in Southern Ontario. About 4 or 5 days later, I started to notice that I was really cold and that my body was sore. And I thought, oh, I wonder if I'm coming down with something. I got a sore throat, and pretty quickly my sore throat, it felt like it was in my chest. And as you know, in my early 20s, I was running a lot, and I knew that sometimes I could get the kind of chest cold where I would need a puffer. And people were talking a little bit more about this pandemic and that there might be shortages on medication. And I thought, I'm just going to be proactive, go to my doctor, say, I've got something going on in my chest. Can I have a puffer? Um, I went to my doctor for an in-person appointment, and when I listed off my symptoms, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "Do you have COVID?" And I looked at her and I said, "Well, I was kind of hoping you could tell me that." And she was really upset, and she sent me out the back door of the office, the doctor's office, so that I wouldn't infect anyone else. And they changed their phone message that very hour, because I called back the hour later. And they had changed the message to, if you have any COVID symptoms, you are not to come into the office. So she was really scared by everything that I was presenting. At that time in Ontario, there were not any publicly accessible COVID tests. She told me to call public health, and I called public health that evening. And I should actually back up a little bit. I went to my doctor's appointment, got home from my doctor's appointment. She told me to isolate, but we'd never isolated before. Like, that was such a foreign concept to us. Like, we'd never done any of these sorts of things before. So I gave my husband my prescription and told him, can you go and get this for me? And can you also get some groceries? Because apparently if we're supposed to be isolating, we're not supposed to be out. I'm not supposed to be out in the world. And so he went grocery shopping, and he came home with like a loaf of bread and a bag of milk. We have 3 kids, like that is not going to last us very long. And he also said, your puffer medication was really expensive, so I didn't get it. So I was kind of upset. But in that time period, our provincial government made an announcement that COVID was circulating amongst the population, and that they were going to extend spring break for schools and shut down some of the businesses. And this had never happened before either, right? So people went into panic mode. And when my husband came home with like no groceries, now mind you, I do all of the grocery shopping, so I don't want to, I can rib him about it now,
Yeah, right.
but he didn't know what he was doing. So I actually went out, even though I was supposed to be staying away from people. I put on a mask and I went out and I got my medication. And, I was in the grocery store, and it was mass panic. I don't know if you went to a grocery store at the beginning of the pandemic in your area, but shelves were bare, huge lineups of people filling their carts. I'd just never seen anything like that in North America before. Anyway, got all the groceries, got my medication. By the next day, I had lost my sense of smell, lost my appetite, feeling nauseous, diarrhea, like a lot of the symptoms of COVID. The only thing that I didn't have was a fever. And at that point in time in Ontario, if you didn't have, and I forget what the 3 symptoms were, but one of them was a fever. If you didn't have a fever, they considered that you didn't have COVID. So although they had a few tests that they could offer to people, if you didn't have those 3 symptoms, you would not get tested. But I didn't have a fever. I had everything else, but not a fever. Now, thankfully, or maybe it's not thankfully, but having access to other information from other cities that were navigating COVID was really helpful to me. Italy had gone through, their huge pandemic wave a month before us. So I was trying to read up, can you get COVID without a fever? Same with New York City. They had, their experience with COVID happened earlier than what it happened for Toronto. And so I learned that, yeah, there are some people who don't have a fever and it's still COVID. So I thought, well, I can't rule it out completely. I did isolate as much as I could from my family, but my youngest at that time, she was like 2.5, 3. And, the thought of being away from mama when I'm in the house, like it was just not possible for her. So she also got sick. And she had like the same symptoms that I did. She did have a fever. She also recovered really quickly. And mine seemed to kind of linger, and the puffers weren't quite helping. But then I did notice a little bit of relief. I mean, I remember being on Zoom calls for work and, still struggling to breathe. Like I would suggest let's meditate for a moment so that I could
Mm-hmm.
go on mute and just try to catch my breath. And, I wasn't right. I wasn't healthy. And so I called my doctor's office and tried to book an appointment. And she said, right now we're not doing any in-person appointments. If it's an emergency, go to ER. And I'm like, well, I'm not quite an emergency. I'm not doing well. The breathing was my biggest complaint. So now we're at the end of March, beginning of April. And, my family's noticing I'm just not shaking this thing. And it was getting progressively worse, but not like an emergency ambulance kind of worse. And I think I was also scared of COVID. I didn't want to go to the hospital. I didn't want to have this unknown, scary thing happening to me. So it was kind of a head game, wanting to be okay, trying to be okay, but not okay. And then by mid-April, I was struggling enough that I couldn't like read a bedtime story to my kids. It was really clear that it was impacting me a lot. And so I went to a walk-in clinic, and the walk-in clinic doctors, they screen you for COVID. And if you have COVID symptoms, you can't get in. Again, because I didn't have a fever, they saw me. He listened to my chest and said, this is probably asthma, increase your puffer dosage. So from that point forward, I was increasing puffer dosages, lots of phone calls to my doctor. And by the beginning of May, COVID tests were more prevalent in my province, but I was also starting to feel better. And I thought, well, whatever I have is leaving. Anyway, it wasn't completely gone though. Like my breathing wasn't back to normal. And my doctor recommended that I make an appointment with a respirologist. I got the paperwork for that, but when I called the respirologist, they weren't taking new patients because of COVID. So these funny symptoms were still lingering. And through the summer, like my period was coming every 2 weeks. I had unexpected weight gain. And for me in the summer, that doesn't happen. I'm pretty active. I'm used to being healthy. So having that weight gain was really strange. Like my face was very puffy. My neck was puffy. I started to lose hair, like chunks of hair, insomnia. By the fall, I was also having difficulty remembering things. And I mean, like normal everyday things. Like I couldn't remember the names of my niece and my nephew.
Wow.
Like that's odd. For someone my age, I thought this is so strange. My grandmother has Alzheimer's, and I thought, is this what it feels like to have Alzheimer's? So I was still in regular contact with my doctor. I told her about the weight gain. I told her about the hair loss, the insomnia, the difficulty remembering. And it was becoming difficult to work. And because she still wasn't doing in-person appointments, and I think also probably everyone was so stressed out at that time. At the beginning of the pandemic, nobody knew what was happening.
Mhm.
So I don't want to say she dismissed me, but you could say that. Um, she said it's probably just stress, do more yoga. And I have a big dog. We were hiking regularly. It wasn't stress. It was not due, like, weight gain was not due to like change in diet or not exercising. Like, there was something going on. Um, Eventually I convinced my doctor to to give me blood work. Um, and when the blood work came back, of course, I don't know how to interpret my own blood work, but she looked at it and said that it was probably fine. And and then I think I felt pretty disillusioned that, I wasn't feeling fine and I wasn't getting a whole lot of medical support. And I've always been interested in like alternative medicine. So I thought, I'm gonna see what else I can figure out. And by that time, there was more understanding of long COVID, and a lot of my symptoms fit with other women my age who had a positive COVID test and felt that their symptoms never left. So I was reading up on what was working for them medically, and like an autoimmune diet seemed to be working really well for them. So I changed my diet to reflect more of an autoimmune diet. Um, and by November, I had stabilized my period. I still had some hair loss, but things felt like they were slightly better, just by changing my diet and switching up some of my vitamin intake. And and then I felt like I had this resurgence of all the same symptoms again. It was really easy to get COVID testing. And so I went, and the doctor said, yeah, I'm pretty sure you've got COVID. You'll have to isolate. My test came back negative. So it was really strange to have like this new cycle of the same symptoms. Um, and then once I sort of recovered from that, again, the same thing that lingered was the breathing, and a little bit of nausea. And but because I kept showing up to the, medical professionals, and I didn't really receive help. I was feeling disillusioned, not really interested in pursuing that anymore for a while. And so I didn't. I even went for an in-person medical exam, and saw my doctor in person. She asked how I was. I even remember telling her I'm fine, because in my mind, I'd given up on that.
Mhm.
And I was trying to find ways to live with it. And I was probably doing a decent job of like adapting to having less oxygen to work with. But I was getting worse. And my family was really pointing out to me, Erin, you're not doing well here. Um, so yeah, that's sort of like the first phase of what happened. Um, to
Yeah.
so
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
you can go ahead if you've got.
Yeah. Well, no, no. So at this point, it's clear, like you know your body. You've gotten to live with it your whole entire
Right.
life. Yeah. And then so you're very aware that something isn't right, and I can only imagine, and literally I can only imagine at whatever level I can quantify. Not just do we have the physical ailment, not just the mental of like, hey, this isn't right, but then you're standing in a corner by yourself.
Mm,
Like there's no, there's no help from the medical system. I say no help. I mean they're not. No one knows what's going on.
right,
I can
right.
only imagine what was the mental emotional cost of this at this time.
Hmm, I don't know, I can be pretty chill. And I think that I think that I was still thinking, if this is something, at some point it'll show up in a way that is medically observable.
Okay.
Um, but in the meantime, we're swirling around in a pandemic. Um, you know, my husband's job is is teetering on the brink of extinction. My work has crashed. We've got 3 kids. Life has to keep going amidst the medical experience that I'm having. So, I could manage, and I thought that's just going to be good enough for now. I think the other layer, when you talk about standing alone in a corner, I think the other layer that started to creep in at that point in time, um, was there was now a vaccine for COVID. And uh, I think I've always had a wide variety of friends. Some people, long before COVID were anti-vax. Some people were, I wouldn't say pro-vax, but lots of people had lots of different opinions. And because I've had the privilege of being healthy, I could hear both sides and not feel triggered about anything. And now I found myself in a different position. Uh, when so by this time, at this point in time, I know that I'm not well. I believe that it's related to COVID, but I can't prove it. Um, and the vaccine is coming out in Ontario. And at first in Ontario, it was rolled out in a way that you had a choice whether or not you wanted to sign up and get it at that point in time. Um, and I wanted it because I had gone through this scary experience of this is what my body did when I believe I got COVID. Whatever protection I can get, I want. So I had a lot of motivation to like sign me up right away. I want to go first for getting this vaccine. Um, However, when I went to get the vaccine, you need to have, like in Ontario, we needed to meet a certain amount of health criteria to even be healthy enough to get the vaccine. And I'm looking at the criteria and I'm like, oh, I don't meet this. But I looked healthy and I kind of used that to my advantage. And at that point in time, they were also more aware of long COVID. So I just said, I tick all of the boxes of things that you don't want. However, this is long COVID. I really want this vaccine. Can you just give it to me? And so they said yes, which I was grateful for. I had to talk to the head nurse and that kind of thing, but I guess I knew what to say and I got it. Um, However, I continued to deteriorate in health, and by July, and this is 2021, in July, I had a really bad night where I couldn't breathe. And my husband, he is a former medic in the Canadian Reserves, and he just kept saying, Erin, we've got to call an ambulance. But it was a strange feeling, like I couldn't breathe. And it was, how we have this narrator in our head that as you're moving around doing different things, the narrator is kind of telling your story as you're doing it. Well, my narrator went quiet and it was just so peaceful. And I couldn't breathe, but I don't quite know how to explain it. I think I was passing out. So when he was saying we've got to call the ambulance, I was just shaking my head no. Because it's peaceful and I was just concentrating on breathing. The next morning I woke up and I was like, suddenly it hit me like, oh my gosh, that was really scary what happened last night. I called my doctor. She said, I can write you a prescription. of a different kind of puffer, or you can go to ER. And as soon as I heard those two options, I thought, I want to go to an ER doctor. I want to be assessed. This was really scary. So I went to ER, and they went through all of the usual tests. And just as every other appointment had gone, I can see by the look on their face, nothing's showing up so far in the tests. And they went through COVID screening, and I got an X-ray, and I'm waiting in my little quiet room for the doctor to return. And I just texted my husband and I said, I think this was a waste of time. I don't think they believe me again. I feel so foolish. Am I making this up? And he said, you are not making this up. And he sent me a recording of my breathing the night before. I didn't even know that he had done that. I'm in this quiet, dark little room listening to my breathing, and I sound like I can't breathe. Sound like I'm dying. And so hearing that just reminded me, like, no, this is serious. I need to self-advocate here. And when the doctor came back, she didn't come into the room. She stood at the doorway and she asked me COVID screening test questions again. So I went through the answers again. And she said, okay, because your X-ray, it looks like you have COVID pneumonia. She said, it's either COVID pneumonia or a very rare lung disease. So we're going to treat it like it's COVID pneumonia or some other kind of pneumonia. Here are some antibiotics. And so I felt relieved. I finally had evidence that something was wrong. And I had medication, and I thought, great, I'm going to take this medication. I'm going to get back to doing all the things that I haven't been able to do in the past over a year. So I felt excited by this X-ray that showed my lungs being a mess. And initially, I actually think that the antibiotics did work initially. I felt some sort of improvement. And then it was a really steep decline. Again, calling my doctor, saying, would you expect this to happen after these drugs? Should I hang in there, or should we be doing something else? So she sent me for another X-ray. The X-ray technician was so lovely. She asked, what brought me in? And I said, do you want the short story or the long story? And she was one of the first people who said, give me the long story. And I appreciated that, just having another human being. Like, I don't know if that was part of her job or if that was just what she was doing, but I shared everything, including, how long I've been trying to get answers. And, she was really nice about it. And she, I think that probably she had a lot of people who would come in and say, I have problems breathing, and maybe it didn't show up on their X-ray. But I noticed that after taking my X-rays, her whole demeanor changed. She was super serious. I know that they're probably supposed to have a poker face, but if I knew how to play poker, I'd probably be pretty good, because I could read her so well. She saw something, and she said, I can have this to your doctor within 2 hours. Hopefully you'll get a call sometime later today. And I didn't get a call later that day. And I didn't get a call the next day either. And so then I called my doctor, and the receptionist said, if you don't receive a call, then it means that nothing's wrong. And I was like, well, that's that. Here we go again. And I had my second vaccine appointment for that week also. And I really wanted to know, can I get this other vaccine? I went to the appointment, and again, the head nurse and I, were reading through what's the protocol if someone has been on antibiotics. I knew that I was within a 2-week window. I was okay to take it. But she said, if you have something wrong with your lungs, I actually think you should be one of the people who is medically exempt from getting vaccinated. And I found myself, I know lots of people at that time in my life would have jumped to avoid getting vaccinated, would have been happy to avoid a vaccine. But again, because of my experience, I really wanted to have it. And as sorry, I can hear my kids coming up the stairs. I'm hoping they don't come in. um, I was really hoping to receive it because I knew that I was getting worse, and it was such a, I was getting worse and it was getting worse really quickly. And I thought, if I don't get it now, I probably won't be able to get it and I won't have that added protection. And I really wanted it. So that time I really had to fight and self-advocate about how much I wanted this, the progression of my disease, how this all started. I think I even might have had to sign an extra consent form. And we had tried calling my doctor, couldn't get a hold of my doctor's office at that time. And anyway, I got it and I was grateful to have it. The next day, my doctor called and said, yeah, your x-ray looks really bad. The x-ray technician has recommended, and I forget if it was like a CT scan or an MRI, but has recommended additional diagnostics, and we're going to get you in to see a respirologist. However, because of COVID and the amount of strain COVID was putting on the system, even for someone who was really sick, I couldn't get an appointment for 3 months later for those things. And so when she booked those appointments, I was like, I don't know how I'm going to make it that long. Anyway, I tried, and I was in ER a lot. Every time I would have a night where I thought I was going to pass out, I would go to ER. And I noticed that ER started to look, it was a really sad place. Prior to COVID, there would be family members accompanying someone who was ill, or elderly people maybe could have someone who could advocate for them. But because of COVID and worry about spread, there were people who had to drop off, a mom who was in a wheelchair, and the mom's confused, and it was so hard, like being in the ER and just watching all of the little stories around me, just gave me a glimpse of how strained our healthcare system was at that time, and how, like, I got to see who the vulnerable were. And I couldn't help but feel, I guess, that started that, like, those images of the people who were in that space and needing care, and not receiving very good care because of the strain on the system. I just started to think differently about all of us and the roles we have to play in supporting the vulnerable members in our community. Maybe I'll take a breath there and get a sip of water.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, so
um, Go
yeah, to
ahead.
keep yeah, oh, no. Tell us, so at this point you're getting to see, first and foremost, you have an awareness that something is going on. And at least that's got to be a little like, hey, we have a direction.
Mhm.
But there's still a pause from getting to that conclusion, and then you're getting to experience at a very intimate level the most vulnerable side of COVID. And
Yeah.
yeah, take us through your experience.
Yeah. Those trips to emergency, they were eye-opening. I think a lot of the people that I know, you know, were privileged to have good health. And one thing about, you know, people who are vulnerable in our society, they often don't have a voice to share their story, so we don't even know about them, we don't even know about their experiences. And if I hadn't had this experience myself, I wouldn't have known this either. I wouldn't have known how heartbreaking it was for, I'm remembering an elderly couple, and they allowed him to go in with her. And I think they allowed him to go in with her because she was in fact dying. And uh, he was trying so hard to keep her spirits up, and he was asking her, you know, what do you think we should have for dinner tonight? What would you like me to make you? And she knew what was happening, and she said, you know, I don't think they're going to let me go home tonight. And he just like squeezed her hand. And you know, those moments that I just got to see firsthand how um, COVID was so hard on so many people. And uh, and those stories that I saw in the ER, they weren't what I was seeing on social media. I wasn't seeing, you know, those individual stories of heartbreak and struggle um, on social media. I was seeing other forms of pain expressed, uh, but not those ones. And I thought it bothered me. It felt like a disconnect that people couldn't see some of this, and some other pieces were really amplified. Um, on one of my trips to ER, I happened to get the same ER doctor that I had had, you know, 2 times before. And he pulled me aside and showed me my x-rays, and he said, you know, we can see you're getting progressively worse quickly. We're going to bump you up to be an urgent patient. If you don't receive a call by the next business day, you need to call. Um, Normally, we would admit you to the hospital, but we, you know, that's not a good option for you because your lungs are so bad that if you were to get anything on top of what you have right now, there's nothing we could do for you. And that was the first time I had heard that. um, and I think because it was the first time I had heard it, I don't know, it didn't quite sink in. I did get a call that first business day. The respirologist booked a phone appointment for the next week. And my friends and family knew that I had some variation in my oxygen levels. And so sometimes I might sound quite normal, and other times I would not be able to talk. Um, and at that point in time, this is now September 2021, I was spending most of my day just sitting on the couch because I couldn't walk very well. Like that would cause me to get lightheaded, and I wouldn't quite say collapse, but I couldn't walk just because of lack of oxygen. And but when the doctor called, I didn't have to fake anything. Like I was having a terrible breathing day. Um, as I was trying to answer his questions, at some point he just said, you know what, I need you to stop talking. I'm concerned that I will have to call an ambulance for you, just based on you trying to answer these questions. I can hear how much of a strain this is for you. We need to do a lung biopsy. And so he arranged for a lung biopsy. And again, because I was an urgent patient at that point, it was, I think 2 weeks was the earliest turnaround time. And at this point in time in our province now, and it wasn't just our province, it was across Canada, there were now vaccine mandates. So if you were a government employee, you were mandated to get a vaccine, or actually, no, I think government employees, it was just there was not an or. Some organizations had other options, like you could work from home or you could take a leave of absence. But it was creating a lot of controversy. A lot of people felt really upset by that, upset by having a mandate. And this was now like the first time that I found myself deeply leaning into the compassion techniques that I had been teaching others, because I was terrified for myself. I needed access to public health care because that's what we have in Canada and in Ontario. Um, and my access to public health care was so intimately tied to what everyone else was doing in terms of disease prevention. So, friends who were posting about anti-mandate, family members who were adamant about anti-vax, it became really hard for me to hear those comments or see those expressions of pain. And it marked a shift for me. It marked a shift. That's when it started to get really hard. I went to get my lung biopsy, and it's a day surgery in Ontario. And I remember as I was filling out my consent forms, the doctor said, by the way, you could get a collapsed lung. For some reason, I really lingered on the collapsed lung aspect, and it turned out to be foreshadowing. So with a lung biopsy, you go to sleep. I was looking forward to that part. And then they put tubing down your throat into your lungs. And because lung tissue is so delicate, they take samples of your lung tissue. And because it's so delicate, it's quite easy to tear your lung tissue. And that would be what collapses your lung. So I go in to get this day surgery, go to sleep. I'm nervous, but everyone's lovely. And then all of a sudden I wake up and I feel something in my throat. My instinct is to sit up and start coughing. So as I do that, the nurse swears, fuck, and says, we'll give you more. And almost as instantly as that waking up has happened, I'm right back asleep. The next time I wake up, I'm in my little day surgery area, and I'm kind of groggy. And one of the nurses comes in and asks, "How are you?" And I said, "I'm okay." She said, "Is there any pain?" And I think I probably have high pain tolerance, but I said, "Yeah, there's some pain in my chest." And I guess I kind of like made this movement with my hands, like blossoming almost. And she kind of looked at me and nodded, and looked at my oxygen levels and left. And then my oxygen levels started beeping. And so she came back in and she turned off the volume and she asked, "Is the pain intensifying?" And I said, "It's not intensifying, it's spreading." And then I showed how it was like blossoming up my lung. And so she ordered an x-ray, like a bedside x-ray. And at that point in time, I noticed like I was getting sleepy, and they said with the x-ray, they get the results right away. And they said, "Okay, you've got a collapsed lung. We'll put you in line for a radiologist who can insert some tubing so that your lung will inflate again." But again, that little storyteller, that was like my cue that I might be passing out. My little storyteller went silent. I was no longer really, making sense of the world around me. I was just like quiet and peaceful. And then I stopped feeling any pain in my chest too. So by the time they were wheeling me downstairs, I remember saying to the nurse when we got to the area, the X-ray and radiology area, I said, I actually think I'm fine now. The pain's gone away. I'm just really tired and I want to go to sleep. And she looked at me and like forced me to like into a standing position in front of the X-ray machine. I don't even think she left the room when they pressed the button. Like it all happened really quick at this point. She had me back on the gurney, and I don't know what they normally do for a collapsed lung, but I hope that they give you some kind of painkiller or something. They really just started jamming the tube in, like they cut me open and jammed the tube in. And I guess, my lungs were really bad, and to only have one really bad lung was maybe a bad scene for me. So yeah, but there was something good that came out of that. They sent me home that night, and like I had the tubing taped to me, and they said, if the tubing comes out, come directly to ER. You don't even have to say anything. Just lift up your shirt and show that the tubing is a mess. They'll know what to do right away. They were worried that I wouldn't be able to talk and explain because my lungs were so bad. They said, just show up and go like this. The other thing that they said was, if you cover up this part of your tubing, you'll suffocate yourself. So don't do that. And in my head, I'm like, why are you sending me home? I don't think I slept much that night, but the next day I went in for them to check my tubing and to see if my lung was inflating. And it was back in the radiology department. And the doctor came out into this little waiting room, and it's really quiet in the waiting room. Everyone's like polite Canadian style quiet. And he came out and he said, your lungs are too diseased. It's not inflating like a healthy person would. Come back tomorrow, we'll check tomorrow. Like no bedside manner whatsoever. But that was actually the first time that I had heard someone refer to my lungs as being diseased. And like he just came in, said this, and turned around and left. And his nurse like ran in and said, "You forgot to give her the paper." Anyway, I was looking around at these other people who are sitting with me, like, did he just say diseased? But everyone's being really polite. And so I left and I came back the next day, and I had a different doctor the next day. And by that point in time, they checked, they did whatever testing they needed to do to make sure that my lung was going to heal the rest of the way on its own. And I had like a half-hour period where they were taking out the tubing and stitching me back up. And so it was just me and a radiology doctor and a nurse. And the doctor said, do you know what this is? Do you know what you have? I saw your x-rays and it's really unusual. And I said, I have no idea. And I told him some of my story. And I also shared with him how hard it was getting to hear other people around me not want to follow mandates that I believed were protecting me and also protecting other vulnerable people. And that was really helpful to have that quiet one-on-one time with him, because he said, yeah, you are a really scary case right now. Like if you get anything, COVID, a cold, anything, if you get anything, we won't be able to help you. We don't have anything to help you because your lungs are that bad. You need to cocoon, and everyone around you needs to know how serious this is. And it was Canadian Thanksgiving that weekend. And so a lot of people were trying to figure out, what are my Thanksgiving plans? Do I mask? Do I not mask? And he said, you can't do anything. You need to just stay away from as many people and as many germs as possible. Um, and so that was scary, like numbing to hear.
Mhm. Did he tell you at this time, did you know what, so you're just finding out at this time that you have a lung disease at all. Is that right?
Well, no. um, they were calling my lungs diseased because they kept seeing x-rays, but um, I don't know what qualifies something to be a disease and what doesn't. I didn't have any name to attach to it. They just looked at my x-rays and said those are diseased lungs. They are not healthy lungs. That is not just pneumonia. That is not just, I don't even know what else would show up on an x-ray, but it was my first time ever thinking of myself as having a disease. Um, so it was like the stitching in my world kind of shifted a little bit.
So still at this point, like now, if correct me if I'm wrong, so now like they know that there's something there, like they're the label they're using is that your lungs are diseased.
Yeah,
But they're aware that you now have conscious awareness with the medical health system that there is an issue with your lungs.
correct. Yes.
Where does that go to? Does it end up getting diagnosed, or where does that go to?
Yeah. So the lung biopsy, the whole purpose of the lung biopsy was to rule out some things and rule in others. And at the end of October, the biopsy test came back, and I had tested positive for pulmonary alveolar proteinosis, which is basically, I wonder if I can describe the science of this and do it
Mm,
justice. Um, Within our lungs, we have, for the oxygen exchange to happen at the alveolar, like the really, really tiny level. Um, so our red blood cells show up and they bring with them the carbon dioxide. And then there's an exchange that happens in our lungs where they drop off that carbon dioxide and they pick up oxygen. For that exchange to happen, it goes through this little filter um, of proteins. And to keep that system going, we have these white blood cells, macrophages, I think they're called, and they clean up the protein and keep everything sort of moving. I was having a buildup of that protein, and that's what pulmonary, that's the area, alveolar, the really tiny sacs, proteinosis, so buildup of protein. And that can be a symptom of like a system overload. Like if you breathed in a bunch of chemicals, you could have this happen and it's a system overload, or it can be an autoimmune disease. And it's a very rare autoimmune disease. So we didn't know at that point which one it was, but we knew that I needed treatment. And the only treatment for that is a whole lung lavage, which uh, I thought sounded like a spa.
yeah, yeah.
Oh, sure, I'll go for a whole lung lavage.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, tell us what it is though.
Yeah. It's a lot worse than I thought. um, Maybe I'll tell more about what it is as I get closer in the story to having it. Maybe that would be a better time to explain it.
Okay.
Um, so my my respirologist, he said, this, whatever you have is so rare. He was old, and he said, I've only seen this one other time in my career, and that was 30 years ago.
Wow.
I'm passing you off to this medical research. I live near a university, a medical research hospital, and I'm going to have them take care of you because the treatment you need is so rare that most doctors don't know how to do it. Um, in the meantime, I went to him one other time. I I I was not doing anything. I had lost like 40 pounds. I was nauseous a lot, couldn't breathe. Um, my mom very gently suggested that she take my dog for a while. That one was really hard.
Mm.
I couldn't talk that often. I was so out of breath. I was waking up, like I would have peaks and valleys throughout the day, but there would always be a time during the night where I would have that scary thing happen all over again of feeling like I'm going to pass out. Um, and so I went to the ER one more time and said, like, I have this appointment over here, but I don't think I'm going to make it. And again, the doctor said, I hear you. I know that you've been here so many times. I'm so scared to admit you unless you are truly like on the verge of dying, because I know what other patients are in this hospital and what diseases and illnesses they have, and I'm worried you're going to get them and you're safer at home. Let me see if I can get you oxygen. And I don't know why no one thought to get me oxygen earlier. Um, when I got assessed for whether I could be approved for oxygen, they said that if I were 65, I could get approved. If I had any of these medications, I could get approved. But just based on what I was presenting, I couldn't get oxygen. And like, here I
Wow.
am feeling like I am not going to make it. So I went one more time to this doctor, and he actually found me a different company that was, they provided veterinary oxygen and they
Mhm.
agreed to take me on. So that was such a strange thing, you know. I felt caught in a system that couldn't see me.
Mhm. Mhm.
um, I went and got some testing done at that doctor before I was passed off to the research medical team. And at that point in time, I was at 40% lung capacity, which is not that great. It's 40%
No.
disease. So, like 40% with the disease. So it was, I, I was definitely a candidate for oxygen. Um, and now we're coming up to Christmas, and there were just so many things swirling around. It was especially hard on my kids because I couldn't do anything. um, at that point in time, we weren't really talking about like, am I dying? We were talking about like my path for living felt like it was narrowing. um, and the Omicron strain of COVID was going through Southern Ontario, and people were exhausted by following mandates. They didn't want to do it anymore. And I was so scared that my path was going to narrow so far that I wouldn't be able to get treatment. And so I just felt really desperate for people to like, please follow all the mandates so that I can have a chance to live. And I posted something like that on Facebook one day before Christmas. And in my book, I talk about it because it was just so painful. And in my book, I received 5 messages from 5 different friends who all messaged back to say, um, I hear you're going through something tough, but I feel so deeply about my freedom to choose, um, that I would be willing to give my own life for this freedom to choose. And that's why I will not be following mandates. And it was so hard to hear because it's so easy to say that if you're not dying. um, I I really do think that when we are faced with, that feeling of I might not make it, especially if you have things to live for like your kids, you'll do whatever. You'll do whatever you need to do to be around. to not have to leave them, or at least for me, I would do whatever so that I
Mhm.
didn't have to leave them without a mom. So it was really hard to receive that kind of response from people that I thought knew me, I thought cared about me, but I think it also speaks to like the collective trauma we were all experiencing at that
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
People were feeling really divisive. It was hard to hear each other and hard to see each other, and people were exhausted. Maybe people felt compassionate or they were willing to do mandates at the beginning, but they were worn out. It had been a long struggle. Um, and even still, I felt like begging people, like, I want to get in the hospital. I want to get this treatment. I was waiting in line. I knew that even as an urgent patient, people who were getting COVID were showing up as emergencies. And so I had to wait until there was enough space within emergencies so that an urgent patient could be seen. They were triaging me constantly.
Mhm.
Um, and they were also very aware that at some point I would be too weak to receive the procedure at all. And they were trying to figure out, at what point can we call her an emergency, um, in all fairness of everyone else's emergencies happening too.
That had to be hard. I mean, even I mean, for everyone involved, but also for the people making the call on triaging.
Mhm.
They're looking at the unit as a whole, obviously,
Yes.
and obviously each individual, yourself being part of that collective, and everyone else that was seeking medical health, they're looking at themselves as an individual. I mean, as much as they can see the whole.
Yeah.
Um, I can only imagine that the amount of stress that you had, but of course everyone was having at some level. I say everyone, I mean some people were having at some level. I wanna pause us here, and I wanna bring us back for a part two, and
Mhm.
I want you to take us through what that what the second half was like, what the met getting through, did you, which don't, I want you to just save the information, and I hate to ruin the end for everyone, but Erin's still here. Did you, I want you to take us through that whole process of finally getting to the medical treatment you need it. But at this point in time, where you're at right now, have you begun the journaling for that which turns into the book?
Oh yes, I had.
Okay.
I had started regularly journaling in the fall. And I think what prompted the regular journaling wasn't just my experience with the disease, it was also grappling with um, messaging that I was hearing from friends and family members of, we don't want to do these things to protect people like you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I was having such a hard time holding on to both parts, like my part, and like I so badly wanted everyone around me in the whole world
Mm-hmm.
to take these mandates that medical people had said, this is our strategy. I wasn't going to argue the strategy. I was just desperate for everyone to just please follow it. um, and I had, because of my experience, I had shrinking capacity to hear other people's
Mm-hmm.
pain or fear or wanting to value something else. It became so hard for me to hear that because my own needs were just so high.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and, I, at that point in time in December, right before Christmas, putting my message out there into the world on Facebook, which maybe wasn't the best idea, but um, receiving messages back from, like I said, 5 different people who knew me and them saying, I'm sorry you're going through this, but no. I just had to, I had to hear their no and hope that I would be okay.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point in time after Christmas, Omicron had a huge spike. We went through another Ontario shutdown. Canada as a whole was exhausted by pandemic related mandates. And there started to be a backlash of different groups joining together and creating a freedom convoy. And so there's this background noise going on of people who are who are protesting in front of hospitals. So the noise that was bringing me pain, the emotional pain, it's one thing to feel like you're dying. It's one thing at one point in time, I was calculating if I want to give my kids one birthday card from this point forward till they're 18, in case I don't make it, like how many birthday cards do I need to ask my husband to pick up for me? So, there's that stuff. And then there was like this swirling stuff of our societal exhaustion. And then, yeah, the group of people that were protesting, I knew some of them. Eventually, my breathing was so bad that I was admitted to the hospital as an emergency patient. And again, so I live in a suburban area, but now I was in a city hospital, and just a different cohort of people who are trying to access emergency medical care. And, seeing a woman who was homeless and just begging to be admitted to the hospital because she was terrified of catching COVID in a homeless shelter. So usually in Ontario, we'll have a little bit of snow and then it'll warm up in December. And then in January, there's usually a deep freeze and it feels brutal. And so this is like the night before the first deep freeze. And just watching all of the staff trying to work through all of these different people with all of their complex needs, just like what you said, trying to balance everything. And it was just a time when I think around the world, all of our needs were so high. While I was admitted to the hospital that first night, they said that some of my blood work came back, that I had the autoimmune disease version of PAP. And so that felt like a relief to finally have a label. They were preparing for me to have this whole lung lavage surgery. And it's a procedure. It's not actually a surgery, but it's a major procedure. It requires a lot of specialized professionals. So there was a team of 20 doctors and physiotherapists. So basically what they do is they put you on a breathing machine with one of your lungs, and they fill the other lung up with fluid. So if someone has pneumonia, they'll do a wash and try to get some of the gunk out of your lungs if you have pneumonia. But with a whole lung lavage, it's a whole lot more liquid. And because of the disease, it's a lot of pressure on your lungs. So they don't actually know if your lung will be able to handle that kind of fluid. And when they put the fluid into your lung, because the proteins are very sticky, it's not like a pneumonia wash where, you would flush it. They put it in your lung, and then they do compressions on your body, on your ribs, to try to loosen up the gunk. So basically, like, they beat you up
Mm-hmm.
on one half of your body while trying to keep the other lung working. And they do that repeatedly. So I think I had 20 full
Mm.
full rounds of it. And I was lucky I didn't have any broken ribs. I guess that's a common experience, to
Mm-hmm.
have a lot of broken ribs after, because they're trying to get the gunk out. I just had a ton of bruising. They were also worried again about another uh, collapsed lung, because of like the sheer pressure of all of that fluid
Mm.
going through over and over again. And it takes hours. It's not a quick surgery. I don't actually remember how long it was. I think it was 8 hours.
Wow.
But they did one lung. They were hoping to do both, but in the end, they could only do half. Um, and I mean, there were things that happened before then too. The hospital was just so overloaded due to COVID. Um, staffing shortages, people who were hospitalized because of COVID. Um, it was hard even when I was an emergency patient. I lost my emergency uh, procedure, emergency status, maybe not status, but my triage position kept changing because other people were coming in. And a lot of it had to do with COVID.
Mm.
Um, anyway, because COVID numbers were so high, and I needed to be in intensive care afterwards to recover, so that, well, it's a major surgery. Um, but again, because of COVID, there were a lot of people who were being admitted to the hospital and needing intensive care beds. And intensive care in that particular hospital, they each have their own room with their own assigned nurse. And that's normally how intensive care operated in that hospital. But because the COVID numbers were so high, they took everybody who didn't have COVID, who didn't need a private room with that extra protection, so that staff could be a little bit more protected from COVID, because you can monitor from the outside instead of having to be interacting with the patient. They took all of us who didn't have COVID, and it's not like they had space in the, well, I guess that's relative. They converted a storage room into an intensive care room, but like there's
Mm.
no running water, no outside. It was a
Mm-hmm.
really
Mm-hmm.
depressing place to be. Um, I've learned since then that it was very rare for me to be conscious and to be in intensive care. A lot of people in intensive care around me were, dying. And, it, as a ward style intensive care, I couldn't turn off any of those sounds. I I did try to like block out some of the sights by putting, like, you have a shower curtain. So I would put the shower curtain around me so that I couldn't see everything. Um, but that was a really hard thing to experience and be so conscious. And I'm a sensitive person, so it wasn't like I could turn it off very easily. And again, I'm waiting for my second whole lung lavage. But the pressure, and I should mention, actually, in the province of Ontario at that time, everything had shut down, including all surgeries except for emergency surgeries. So if you were a cancer patient and you were waiting for some sort of cancer surgery, you were considered elective because it could be scheduled. It was
Wow.
really only people who, car accidents, people who were like imminent death. So I was imminent death, but still being triaged.
Mm-hmm. Aaron,
Um,
I think I would love to if I would love to pause us right here and bring us back for a part two.
okay.
If you're willing to. And I say right here, I want you to kind of take us to a place, but I'd love to bring us back for a part two. I want to continue to explore the second lung lavage when you get day two at the spa.
Mhm.
Okay, a little.
Yeah.
I'm glad you laughed at that. Thank you. You said it first.
You did.
Yeah, no, lung lavage. It sounds like something like, oh yeah.
I know, right?
Yeah, I suppose all the bruises afterwards leave a different taste in your mouth. I want to hear about the second process, and then obviously the continued psychological cost of this entire experience. There's so many layers to it. I mean, experience in like it sounds like you use the word sensitive. Would it be fair if someone said you were an empath, or would that not be fair?
Yeah, maybe.
And forgive me, I don't want to make a label, but it sounds like you can feel other people. You feel a lot. It sounds like,
Hmm.
and for those that are listening, there's plenty of people that can relate with that. And for people that can feel a lot when Aaron was in that situation, I'm speculating, I'm projecting, but you're feeling everyone else's energy, not just they don't even have to speak words. So now you have your ball of energy of what's going on in your world, worried about your health, your life, your kids, your husband, your family. Plus, you're feeling the energy of all these other people suffering in some kind of way.
Hmm.
You're in extreme proximity of them.
Hmm.
Plus, there's the psychological cost of, oh, by the way, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get the medical treatment that I need in time.
Hmm.
And then the psychological cost of people that I love dearly, like they are my friends. Um, and right now, in the condition of the world, are speaking to me in a way that hurts maybe more than you've ever experienced with friends.
Like,
I I can't imagine the weight that you were under in that time. Can you what would you I want to hand it back to you and kind of take us to a place where we can meet for part two and dive back in. Um,
so
yeah.
you're so you're looking for me to start up the part two or like close down part one?
No. Anything you want to recap or for closing up in part one.
Okay. I think you did a really lovely job of capturing all of the different aspects. Um, yeah, like when I think back about what was most difficult, it was the combination of recognizing like my path of living, and my body was doing a great job of living, right up until like the very last breath. I knew my body was adjusting and doing everything it needed to do, and recognizing all of that might not be enough. And it might not be enough because um, we just had Christmas. People were too tired of, social distancing to not see their families. And now I am experiencing the impact of that.
Mm,
And I might not make it. I might not make it to be able to say, hey, we're so interconnected. You spending time with your elderly or um, family member, and now they're in the hospital, and we're all fighting for these same resources, and there may not be enough to go around.
mm. Wow. Aaron, I appreciate everything that you shared today and your vulnerability. I can only imagine how many people relate to this in their own way. Obviously, they weren't going through exactly what you were going through, but a lot of people are listening to this and they're relating in some way right now and they're connecting with you in some way. We're going to dive back in and we're going to do a part 2 and we're going to finish telling this entire story, but for those that have felt you for those that have connected with you, for those that want to connect with you more, maybe they're inspired what they've heard, and maybe it's doing coaching with you, or maybe it's just them sharing with you, or maybe they have questions. What's the best way or best place for people to connect with you, Erin?
I spend a lot of time on Instagram, so you can find me at my handle Meta Mentoring, METAMentoring. And I also have a website, www.metamentoring.ca, Canada. Um, and yeah, I have a book that goes into the feelings and the compassionate parts in more detail, finding ahimsa. And I also run a regular compassion practice group. We meet on Zoom once a month. So if practicing compassion skills interests you, I would suggest check that out. I know that it can take some time to feel comfortable. You might not want to jump in right away if you're feeling vulnerable, but maybe, start by checking me out on Instagram or reaching out in some way.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love the practice of compassion. Um, the world needs it, possibly. I won't say more now than ever, but it needs it in a very strong way right now. I
Mhm.
was actually just talking to someone recently, and sharing how, with what the world went through and back up just 2 years ago, this is just my projections, my words, my labels. But the world saw a lot of dark, and that's just metaphorically speaking. And the counter of that is light, and we are going to re-expand the light on this earth with our compassion. So I love that you are a steward of compassion, and that you serve, helping others and creating, facilitating compassion in the community. I'm excited to bring you back on. Let me ask you this. For someone that wants to dive in and read your book, where's the best place for them to find it?
Right now, Amazon. I have the e-copy and paper copy. I'm working right now on the audio. And
Beautiful.
I'm also working on getting it in some other places. Oh, it's in Barnes and Noble too.
Beautiful.
Um, but yeah, more options to come. I'm on the slow game for getting the book out there in the world, not the sprint.
Beautiful. And would you hold up? You have a copy of that book
I
near you, don't
do.
you? And
Yeah.
for those of you that are listening to the audio, you can check us out on YouTube, the channel Success After Trauma, and you'll be able to see a copy of the book. And if you're checking us out on YouTube, you can download us on your favorite podcast streaming platform, so you can listen to us on your way to work or wherever that may be. And make sure you check us out next week, because we're going to have part 2 of Erin's story, where she's going to finalize this mountain of a journey that she went through, and take us into the inception, the creation of the book. And if you would, Erin, next week I'd love to have you elaborate a little bit more on your business model and how you're serving through compassion as well.
Great. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. And everyone, until next week, be great. It's already in you.